Welcome everyone to another episode of Darshan Talks. We again have the pleasure of having Deborah Callyer with us. Deborah was a high-level computer exec in, I'm going to call it a past life. I don't actually know if you still work in that area, but now she is a patient advocate. She is the mother of research, and that is a conversation I'm really, really excited to have with her. We have already spoken to her about her experiences around pharmacists. But let's sort of go into stuff she does regularly, which is talk to companies about research.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Welcome, Deborah, again.
Thank you.
So you've spoken before, and you've mentioned how patients are people, and how treatments fail people, and it's not people failing treatments. But how do we actually get patients involved to ensure that treatments don't fail them as often?
Well, I'm not sure that's actually the patient's job.
I love it.
See, here we are. This is the mindset within medicine and research. Even people who kind of get it and want to include patients in things.
Yeah.
Our whole vernacular is set around it's the patient's job to do all of these other things. And if they don't do it, then it's their fault that we're not doing a good job.
Well, I'm thinking more about how do you empower patients?
Yes. No, I know. That's the new way to think about it, which is great.
Okay.
I think we need to give people information in the way that they can understand it, and then take action on it, which are health literacy principles. And I know you did some podcasts with Katina O'Leary from Health Literacy Media, which is great. Definitely, people should listen to those.
Absolutely.
So that's the first way. We have to arm them with good information that is useful. And that's one thing that really medicine and research don't do well, because they're looking at it from their own perspective and in the way that the system has evolved. I don't think anybody set up the systems the way they are because they're kind of broken. So I would hope not. So that's one of the messages is that, patients are people, treatments fail patients, not the other way around. We need to correct everyone who says it the other way, because it's actually inaccurate. And it actually sets up barriers between the kind of patient engagement and centricity that is now, we need to turn those from buzzwords into reality. Yeah. And in order to do that, you can't keep using the same language that we've always used, which puts patients down on a very low rung compared to everyone else in the medical world who's knowledgeable and needs to impart things to people. So it is actually the person's life that we're talking about, whether or not they have a life-threatening disease or not. Medicine is only one part of a person's life. Absolutely. What they're trying to do is figure out how to fit their new disease or illness into the rest of their life. Whereas the medical community and research community are only thinking about that part of the person. You see what I mean?
I hear what you mean, and I'm struggling. So I want you to educate me a little bit further. So the medical community and the research community is thinking about patients fitting into their processes. And as you pointed out, right, there's a lot more to a patient. It's an entire life. The big question is, how do you do it right then?
Okay. So we could go in lots of different directions here.
I want to give you a little bit of flexibility there.
Do you want to talk about the research side of things?
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit more about the research side of things here.
Okay. What I've been amazed at with, let's just call them sponsors of clinical trials, for example. Mm-hmm. When a company...
just to be clear, before we go on, when we say sponsors, depending on the audience, we're talking about the pharmaceutical companies here. Or right, medical device companies, but please continue.
Or medical device companies, or it could be, in academics. Yes. Sometimes they develop Absolutely. Things on their own. There's even some government programs and studies that are done. So I'm meaning it, I guess, in a broad sense.
Yes.
What's always amazing to me, having come from the computer industry and having a marketing background, is that there isn't a lot of market research that's done first. And that's where a lot of the patient engagement and patient centricity concepts are coming from, is you've got to know your audience and what their issues are. You already know what your issues are, and you take care of those very well. But in order to actually create products that meet the needs of the patients we're all ultimately serving, we have to understand what their situation is, what their issues are, and incorporate those into the clinical trials and the research that's done. Otherwise, we miss part of the mark. And sometimes that mark can be very important, especially if you want to get reimbursed for those drugs or devices.
Right. So when you talked about market research, you talked about your own background in marketing. Here's my question. Are you suggesting that when a company is developing a quote unquote target product profile, they're trying to build what that ideal product would look like, that in those early genesis periods is when a patient should even be in the room?
There can be patient input that can be given in different ways, from the very beginning of a development plan through protocol development in an individual clinical trial, through the activation process, site preparation, recruitment, retention, and results.
Quick question. When you said in the activation plan and site enrollment, what did you mean there? Because I mean, I can think through a lot of the other ones, but those two, wouldn't that be necessarily between the company and the physician in this case?
Yes, but also remember that physicians and clinicians who do clinical trials are very busy. They have multiple things pulling on them.
Yep.
They may or may not understand the trial, the priority of the trial, what that would mean to their patient base. They're looking for patients for their trial. What patients are looking for are trials for themselves. That's actually an important distinction.
It's a critical distinction.
Yes.
But I don't think about it until it's highlighted to me, but so thank you.
Right. So if we want people to be to enroll in clinical trials, we need to think about what does that trial offer a person, not just why we've set up the clinical trial and isn't this cool science.
Right.
And that includes, when I say patients, in my head, I'm also thinking providers.
Oh,
because we are a team, and patients can only get treatments and clinical trials through their provider. And by the way, there are very few providers who do clinical trials. That's another subject.
Yeah, I believe it's only about 3% of providers actually engage in clinical trials. So I'm 100% with you. Now, that really raises an interesting point to me, which is, in many ways, you're engaging with these patients and you're trying to, and when I say you, I mean, obviously the pharma companies are engaging with these patients and they're trying to get their input. But at the same time, let's be honest, pharma is considered the big bad in the world, and they're badly in need of an image makeover. On top of that, they do marketing, which doesn't do pharma any favors. Here's my question. Wouldn't this be considered marketing, and wouldn't this sort of exacerbate the problem?
There is a different, so in my marketing background, a large part of what I've done is communication and training, as well as sales, but that's a whole other area. There is a major difference between giving good information and listening, having a dialogue, than there is in advertising and sales.
Okay.
And most people don't understand that. There's actually a profession of marketing and market research, which is very different than the advertising and sales side of things. It's a lot of psychology. It's a lot of listening and observing. And then it's basically data collection and then data analysis, so we can turn that into knowledge that can be used that will help patients. So that's the part that I don't see a lot of history in. Companies seem to rely on their commercial marketing people and medical affairs side of things, rather than inserting a part of market research into their development plans, which could be very useful. And I talk to sponsors a lot about that.
I can't. I would pay money to be a fly on the wall when you talk to them, because that's a fascinating conversation all by itself. But you're sort of getting into this direction of having a two-way conversation, and that's critical. Almost, and maybe even less than two-way. I mean, it's one of those things my mom always taught me, which is you have one mouth and two ears for a reason. Do twice the amount of listening, and let's be honest, I don't do a good job with that. But as a pharma company, as a sponsor, we need to do a better job listening. My question for you is, would that be considered? I mean, and I'm afraid to go down this path because we're running out of time here, but there's a whole discussion about lay language summaries and the ability to take input from patients. The concern, however, always exists, depending on how you do it. Are you advertising? And if you're advertising, do you need to follow the same steps? And that's becoming a huge problem that a lot of pharma companies I advise to seem to face. What is your take on that? Do you see that as promotional? Do you see, am I sort of going down barking up the wrong tree, if you will?
It can be promotional if you don't apply certain principles and rules ahead of time. So it's almost like, I think we could build a protocol of communication with patients and patient communities, I should say, that could be adhered to, right? Complied with within a company standpoint or a sponsor standpoint, that would be non-promotional. But it has to be carefully considered and actually planned that way.
I think what you may be referring to, however, is the tone of the communication. I wonder if the FDA would see the piece itself as non-promotional, would see the piece as promotional irrespective of the tone. It's
always in how you do it, right? It's not what you do, it's how you do it. So yes, tone, communication. If you're imparting information that is useful to people, then they can take the ball and use that. And there are ways to do that where you can use non-promotional language so that it's more objective, and you're giving the pros and cons in an objective way.
So it's fascinating you say that, and I write books on promotional compliance, and I advise a bunch of companies on that. So I can have a field day with this and just sort of us explore this area a lot more. So maybe we'll do that in the future, because you're absolutely fascinating and fun. Yeah, that'd be great. But the question that comes up out of this whole thing is appropriate engagement and supporting patients and making sure that patients' needs are met. One of the things that stood out to me, there's a group out in Georgetown which looks at inappropriate engagement with patients and talks about how patient engagement is being weaponized. Are you familiar with this group at all?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm sure I can send you some links around it in the future. But essentially the question becomes, what do you recommend as appropriate ways to engage with patients, whether it's in the context of research, whether it's in the context of promotional compliance earlier or promotional later?
Right. So I think the most important word you just used is context. And I've said that before, I will say it again. What's always missing for patients is context. If we help people with that, to understand the landscape that they are now involved in and what decisions they need to be making and why, not telling them what decisions to make is very important. And I agree that, there are landmines here and promotional language. And there's a lot of misleading information, not just in medicine and pharma, but, throughout our lives. And, now we've got the political scenes going on all over the globe, and, who knows what's going to happen. But there is a way to give information and get feedback from people that can be very helpful. And that loop, I think, is the important part. And that's how you stay honest, is by making sure the words you use are factual and balanced. And then you get feedback so that you're sure people understand what you're trying to say.
Those are great words to end this. Any last thoughts, Deborah, at this point?
Tons, but we don't have time for those. Thank you. This has been fun.
This was great. Thank you so much again.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshontalks.com.